The Select Committee on Intelligence will now come to order. Without objection, the committee may recess at any point. The purpose of today's hearing is to receive testimony from a panel of expert witnesses to review the policy impacts of the final report of the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States in the 25 years since the 9/11 attacks. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. 25 years ago, on September 11th, our nation endured an unprecedented attack, leaving profound loss, devastation, and confusion in its wake. All of us over a certain age remember clearly where we were on that day and the overwhelming emotions were experienced. The images will forever be etched into our national memory. Not since Pearl Harbor 60 years prior had an attack like this shocked the collective American conscience. Americans wanted to know, who did this? Why did they do this? And how could this happen to the most powerful country in the world? In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States was commissioned by Congress to answer those questions. The 9/11 Commission subsequently published its findings in a report in July of 2004. In this report, the Commission offered 41 recommendations to address the existing security gaps that were exploited by al-Qaeda. As a result of the 9/11 Commission's work, sweeping reforms to the intelligence community were adopted to combat the threats posed by radical Islamic terrorism. Perhaps most notably, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the National Counterterrorism Center were created by Congress as a result of the Commission's recommendations. Other recommendations were adopted in whole, some in part, and others not at all. 25 years after the 9/11 attacks, this committee is re-examining the Commission's final report to inform our decision-making about our national security policy priorities today. We have three primary objectives as we conduct our review. First, how effective were the 9/11 Commission's reforms on our nation's intelligence enterprise and what areas require further attention? Second, how has the threat landscape evolved over the last 25 years? And last but certainly not least, what recommendations can we offer to address new and emerging threats that undermine the safety and security of the American people? As previously stated, the threat landscape has shifted dramatically. Consider the advancements in technology since 9/11. In AI, quantum computing, drones, cyber and asymmetric warfare, biothreats, the list goes on. On top of that, we now live in the era of great power competition that presents significant national security challenges with China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. The reemergence of great power competition, combined with an age of rapid technological advancement, has created an unprecedented threat environment. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, we learned a hard lesson that a failure of imagination paired with a reactive, defensive national security posture was insufficient to combat the emerging threat of terrorism. As then CIA Director Tenet said at the time, the system was blinking red, but the proper national security measures weren't implemented in time to thwart the terrorist plot. We find ourselves in a similar blinking red situation today. To combat emerging threats in the dynamic world in which we live, we must have a proactive and offensive strategy. We must be prepared and forward-looking about the threats we face. Today we kick off our efforts to learn from the policy failures of the past in order to safeguard our nation from new and emerging threats. We are fortunate to hear from three witnesses with deep expertise across intelligence, counterterrorism, homeland security, and national security law. The Honorable John Pistole served as Deputy Director of FBI during a critical period of post-9/11 reform and later led the Transportation Security Administration, where he oversaw major aviation security initiatives, including TSA PreCheck. Dr. Bruce Hoffman is one of the nation's foremost experts on terrorism and counterterrorism. His decades of scholarship and service, including on the FBI 9/11 Review Commission, provided important perspective on how the threat landscape has evolved since the original 9/11 Commission report. Mr. Jamil Jaffer brings extensive experience in national security law, intelligence policy, cyber issues, and congressional oversight, including prior service on this committee and in the White House. Together, these witnesses will help the committee assess what reforms have worked, where gaps remain, and how the United States should adapt to today's emerging threats. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today and examine the 9/11 Commission report and the profound impact it's had on our national security policies and the intelligence community. Your perspectives and insight will prove invaluable for the work of this committee. I now want to recognize Ranking Member and gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Crawford, and thank you to our briefers for being with us today in our first public event as part of our bipartisan review of the 9/11 Commission report recommendations led by Representative Stefanik and Representative Gottheimer. Almost a quarter of a century ago, we experienced the worst terrorist attack in U.S. history, killing nearly 3,000 Americans. Over 160 residents of Connecticut were killed in the attacks, many of them from my district. I happened to be in Lower Manhattan that day, and I remember the horror and the terror that permeated the environment, as well as the heroism of the first responders, so many of whom lost their lives. I also remember the remarkable feeling of unity that spanned this country for some period of time afterwards. There really is no more important task for the intelligence community, as well as the intelligence committees, than making certain that we are doing everything we can to prevent such attacks on Americans. The IC, of course, is the first line of defense in counterterrorism. 2 decades ago, the bipartisan 9/11 Commission, established by Congress to investigate why we were unable to identify and stop the 9/11 plot before the attack, outlined just how important the IC's role is. The Commission identified critical failures in intelligence processes that prevented any one agency or analyst from having all the pieces of the puzzle that may have allowed them to identify the plot. The lack of information sharing across agencies was a key problem identified by the Commission, and it remains a priority today. The Commission also highlighted how important it is that we have a team of serious, non-political, deeply expert people looking at this threat, who are able and willing to provide insights to senior policymakers, even when those insights may be unwelcome or uncomfortable. It is vital that the intelligence community is able to play that role and not be a part of the political partisan morass. The Commission also issued a number of recommendations to strengthen the IC, including creating the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the National Counterterrorism Center. Today, we'll have a chance to hear from 3 national security experts who have been tracking these issues for many years. Our witnesses have deep knowledge of how the U.S. national security apparatus developed after 9/11, areas where the IC and the U.S. government more broadly can continue to improve, and the nature of the terrorist threat that the U.S. faces today. With changes across the terrorist landscape, including a decentralized threat from scores of offshoot groups and rising lone wolf radicalization, coupled with novel threats we couldn't have imagined 2 decades ago, like the potential for terrorists to leverage the advances of AI technology, it's vital that the IC is postured to warn against new threats so we can take action to make Americans safer. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize the distinguished chairwoman of HPSCI's 9/11 Commission Review Task Force, Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, for an opening statement.
Thank you to Chairman Crawford, Ranking Member Himes, and my co-chair, Congressman Josh Gottheimer, for working to convene today's vitally important hearing. This is our 5th hearing or briefing as a part of this commission, which have been conducted in the classified and now today in the unclassified setting. 25 years ago, our nation endured the September 11th terrorist attacks that forever changed the course of American history. In the aftermath of 9/11, it became clear that our national security and intelligence architecture needed to evolve to meet a rapidly changing threat landscape. The reforms that followed strengthened coordination, intelligence sharing, and our ability to detect and disrupt threats on our homeland. Today's hearing is an opportunity to examine those reforms, assess what has worked, identify areas that require modernization, and ensure we continue adapting to emerging threats of today and the future. The purpose of this commission is to review the effectiveness of the reforms that emerged from the 9/11 Commission report and to evaluate whether our intelligence and national security institutions are fully equipped to address today's challenges and tomorrow's threats. The world has changed dramatically over the past 25 years. One reality, however, remains constant. America continues to face determined adversaries who seek to exploit vulnerabilities and undermine our national security. And we are now confronting a rapidly evolving threat environment that includes advanced drone technologies, foreign malign influence operations, cyber attacks, biothreats, and artificial intelligence developments with profound national security and counterterrorism implications. Congress has a responsibility to confront these issues directly. We must ensure that our national security and intelligence institutions remain agile, forward-looking, and prepared to stay ahead of the evolving threat landscape before our adversaries can exploit gaps. Today, we are joined by a panel of witnesses who played significant roles in strengthening our intelligence community and national security framework in the years following 9/11. Thank you for being here today. I look forward to your testimony and to a thoughtful discussion on how we must continue to protect the American people in an increasingly complex threat environment. I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman, and it's now my privilege to recognize the ranking member of the HPSCI's 9/11 Commission Review Task Force, Congressman Josh Gottheimer, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Crawford, Ranking Member Himes, and Co-Chair Stefanik for your leadership. Thank you to our witnesses for being here with us this morning. September 11th was one of the darkest days in our nation's history, and we all share a solemn responsibility to honor the victims and their families, many of the victims continue to suffer from 9/11 illnesses today. We have to do everything possible to make sure an attack like that never happens again. I think many of us remember exactly where we were when the towers were struck. On that awful day, my home state of New Jersey lost 750 of our own, including many in my district, the second most of any state. Today's briefing marks our first public event as part of this bipartisan review of the 9/11 Commission report. As Chairwoman Stefanik mentioned, we've had many other hearings in a classified setting. We're taking a hard look at where the Commission's recommendations succeeded, where gaps remain, how the threat landscape has evolved, and what our intelligence community and broader national security apparatus needs to confront the threats of today and tomorrow. We're grateful to hear from leading national security and counterterrorism experts about the current state of the intelligence community and our broader counterterrorism efforts. The world has changed dramatically over the past 25 years. The question, of course, for all of us is, are we prepared today? There were gaps then. Are there gaps now? Terrorist organizations and lone actors now have access to more sophisticated technology, more advanced weaponry, and global online platforms that allow them to spread hate and radicalize individuals from halfway around the world without ever crossing a border. We continue to see the persistent threat here at home. Earlier this year, we saw multiple terrorist-related plots and attacks, including a bombing attempt in New York City and an anti-Semitic vehicle ramming attack at Temple Israel in Michigan, while 140 preschoolers were inside. At the same time, entirely new threats have emerged, from cyber attacks targeting our critical infrastructure to bioterrorism to the growing misuse of artificial intelligence and other advanced technologies by our adversaries. That's why this review matters so much. We need to ensure our intelligence community has the tools, technology, coordination, and authorities necessary to stay ahead of evolving threats while protecting the freedoms and values that define us as Americans. We look forward to hearing your perspectives on the current threat environment, where vulnerabilities remain, and what more Congress and the administration can do to strengthen our national security posture and keep the American people safe. We're very grateful for your time today. I want to again thank the chairman and the ranking member for affording this committee the opportunity for an in-depth real analysis on the report. Thank you so much.
Thank the gentleman. And again, I want to welcome our witnesses today. I'm pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this very important topic. I ask that our witnesses now please rise, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you'll give before the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. I want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today. I now recognize the Honorable John Pistol for 5 minutes to summarize the opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Crawford and Ranking Member Himes and the distinguished co-chairs of this initiative and the rest of the distinguished members of this committee. In my past life, with almost 27 years with the FBI, and then I had the opportunity to testify before this committee almost always in closed session, so this is an unusual opportunity, and I thank you for that. And then obviously my time at TSA, other opportunities to testify in different committees. In looking at the 9/11 Commission, which I testified in front of 3 times, the 2 takeaways that I think everybody is aware of, which really impacted the FBI and I think the U.S. government as it looked at how we could best not only identify potential attacks, but mediate and mitigate, and then prevent if need be, and then respond to if need be, was that they found that the U.S. government had a failure of imagination, that phrase, a failure of imagination. How is it that we did not envision such an attack as the 19 hijackers on 9/11? And then what they said was needed was a, quote, unity of effort. And so that unity of effort was unfortunately sorely lacking on 9/11. Again, I had been in the FBI for 18 years when 9/11 happened, and it was something that the FBI, frankly, was not focused on in terms of foreign terrorists coming to the U.S. and doing things such as hijacking planes and using them as weapons and missiles. And so what stemmed from that, a number of executive orders from President Bush, and then the joint inquiry between this committee and the Select Committee, the Senate Committee on Intelligence, SISI, which published a report in December of 2002, just 15 months later, which predated the 9/11 Commission's excellent work, really set the stage for what should the government be doing. And it wasn't like the FBI or the agency or NSA or any other components were waiting for things to happen. So there was much being done behind the scenes. I'll summarize the rest of my statement by saying the 9/11 Commission recommendations were thorough, and they were accurate, and they were timely. And so the changes that we made in the FBI, when I became the deputy director in the fall of 2004, the senior career position, working with Director Mueller, it was a matter of how do we best position ourselves for not only the collection of intelligence based on the new DNI, the Director of National Intelligence as was referenced, but how do we analyze that and share that on a timely basis and then action that as appropriate here in the homeland. So those steps, those recommendations that have been made, were timely, and I believe that we are better served today than what we were then. That being said, the threats are still out there, and the risks are high. And so, for example, the creation of TSA is one of those steps that would prevent another 9/11 from happening. But what other steps or threats are out there that have been referenced in some of your opening remarks? So with that, I'll yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and I recognize Dr. Bruce Hoffman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Crawford, Ranking Member Himes, distinguished co-chairs, and committee members. I'm immensely honored and humbled to testify before this committee, not least since I appeared before the committee 25 years ago, just 2 weeks after the 9/11 attacks, and when I then also provided testimony on the subject of counterterrorism policy, threats, and intelligence reform. First, let me state the obvious. The United States has not experienced another major terrorist attack like 9/11, nor anything even close. This is a towering achievement. During the dark and fearful days following 9/11 and the early years of the war on terror, such a result was then a matter of faith and hope and was far from certain. It is proof how important the 9/11 Commission's recommendations in 2004 Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act have been in keeping our country safe from another massive terrorist attack. But today, the superstructure of the security architecture that emerged is either fraying, being dismantled, or falling into disrepair. We are losing the expertise, knowledge, and institutional memory assembled over the past 25 years. In terms of the reorganization of the USIC that followed the 9/11 attacks, the criticisms of and concerns about the ODNI are both longstanding and well-known. On the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, the 9/11 Commission's co-chairs expressed dismay that the DNI was still not, and I'm quoting, the driving force for intelligence community integration that the Commission had envisioned. And they also noted that the DNI's role over budget and personnel remained lamentably ambiguous. These concerns have arguably not abated. The NCTC, with its narrower remit, is perhaps more easily assessed. At the time of its creation, the preeminent threat to Americans came from abroad. Today, the threat is as much domestic as it remains foreign, with the line between what were once two separate and distinct phenomena having eroded. Yet the principal agency responsible for the analysis and synthesis of terrorist threats and implementation of coordinated counterterrorism strategic operations is legally barred from taking action to counter domestic terrorism. This seems a dangerous anachronism. More than a decade has passed since the review that I co-led, which assessed the FBI's transformation from a law enforcement agency to one with enhanced intelligence and counterterrorism missions. Our basic conclusion was positive. The FBI, we found, had made measurable progress between 2004 and 2014 in developing end-to-end intelligence capabilities and significantly improving information sharing and collaboration with partners both at home and abroad. The FBI's evolution in this regard, we found, had continued to protect the homeland against another catastrophic terrorist attack. But the report also identified areas of improvement. Foremost among these was in human intelligence, which the Commission concluded had not kept pace with other significant advances in the law enforcement dimension of counterterrorism. Hand in glove with improved human capabilities, the report had argued, were related training opportunities. In this respect, the Commission had cited the FBI's expansion of new agent training from 16 weeks to 21 weeks per the 9/11 Commission's recommendations. Recent reports, however, that the duration of new agent training has returned to the original 16-week time frame inevitably raises questions about whether the National Security Branch, and specifically intelligence skills training, was reduced or perhaps even eliminated, and how the shorter training period may have affected acquisition of this enhanced and critical accompanied skills. The Commission was also concerned about the FBI's analytical cadre. We concluded that the FBI still needed to professionalize this key dimension of its intelligence operations and responsibilities. The effective integration of analysts with agents in the field, we found, had then yet to be achieved. More than a quarter of a century has passed since 19 terrorists hijacked 4 passenger aircraft and changed the course of history. Every U.S. president since 9/11 has declared victory over al-Qaeda or ISIS. But as General James Mattis, then commander of the U.S. Central Command, famously cautioned in 2013, and I quote, "No war is over until the enemy says it's over. We may think it is over, we may declare it is over, but in fact the enemy gets a vote." Close quote. And America's enemies have incontrovertibly chosen to continue this war, regardless of our declarations, proclamations, or inclinations. It is therefore imperative that our intelligence community continues to have the personnel, tools, and resources needed to keep the homeland safe. Thank you again for this opportunity to share my thoughts and research with you this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman. Mr. Jeffer, I'm glad you're here. I understand you had some difficulty on your way. I'm glad you're safe. Before I recognize you, I'm just going to ask that you raise your right hand so that we can swear you, as your panelists have already been sworn. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you give before the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Let the record reflect the witness has answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Please be seated. And Mr. Jeffer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you and the ranking member, Mr. Himes, Chairwoman Stefanik, and Ranking Member Gottheimer for your leadership in holding a bipartisan review of the 9/11 Commission's recommendations. I apologize that traffic on 395 delayed me in getting here, but I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the committee. The reality, Mr. Chairman and Chairwoman Stefanik and ranking members, is that the threat to America remains massive. Al-Qaeda and ISIS together number 30 to 50,000 fighters worldwide. ISIS in Khorasan has demonstrated the ability to operate outside of its region against Western interests across the board. We've seen attacks by Iraqi Shia groups. We've seen attacks by Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. You name it, every terrorist group out there in the world today that wants to come after Americans and our allies remains active, remains aggressive. As if that weren't enough, China remains an ongoing threat to the United States, both here in the homeland and abroad. They operate against their own people in the United States. They employ students, temporary workers, and cyber operations to come after our businesses and our nation's security. Russia is no slacker itself. Iran remains aggressive, and in the aftermath of Operation Epic Fury, Midnight Hammer, and Project Freedom, remains committed to attacking America both abroad and in the homeland. And North Korea, of course, has ballistic missiles tipped with nuclear weapons that can now reach the West Coast and perhaps further into the American homeland. We are, without a doubt, at the highest state of threat our nation has ever faced, including and not limited to the time before the 9/11 attacks. And yet, we may be taking our eye off the ball. How so? A simple example. Section 702, the single most valuable intelligence collection authority the U.S. government has, by every Attorney General, every Director of National Intelligence, every Vice President, President have had that authority, have said that publicly and in testimony for this committee and others. And yet, we engage in an act of political brinksmanship every 2 to 3 to 4 years, where we renew that legislation and we come up right to the edge and potentially don't renew it. We've had times when it's gone out of operation. Even though we have existing authorizations, we have seen the telecommunications providers and technology companies limit their cooperation in those times of gap. The idea today that we remain operating with a temporary authorization authority is a train wreck in this era of heightened threats. Congress ought to not only reauthorize Section 702, it ought to make it permanent, and it ought to reject any effort to impose a warrant requirement on that authority and rebuild the very wall that the 9/11 Commission advocated and that we did, in fact, dismantle over the last 20-plus years. Beyond Section 702, there are a number of other things that we ought to do to help protect our nation in this era of great threat. We need to get on the offense, not just against terrorists, but against counterintelligence threats here in the homeland, to include but not limited to China and Russia. We need to get on the offense on collection. We need to expand our collection authorities, not limit them. We ought to consider the potential for the need to address the hot pursuit problem where terrorists and other foreign intelligence threats overseas are being collected upon. They arrive in the United States. We immediately have to go down on coverage and aren't able to restore that coverage rapidly. There are emergency authorization authorities available under existing FISA. They're ineffectual and don't work. We need better authorities there. We need to up our game on counterintelligence here at home. I know the committee is looking at this issue, and the chairman that you've been leading on this effort. We ought to consider an operations center to help the FBI do a better job and interact more effectively with the larger interagency community. And we ought to take advantage of the revolution in artificial intelligence. The intelligence community is best posed with its compute and data collection capabilities to take real advantage of artificial intelligence, but there are concerns, and legitimate concerns, about privacy and civil liberties. We ought not let those concerns get in the way of using this technology to our advantage to advance our national security. The intelligence community has terabytes and thousands of paper files of data going back decades that can be consolidated, reviewed, and assessed using artificial intelligence and put to work. We can use compartmented information to provide insights at a lower classification level through the power of artificial intelligence and the compute the IC has. And finally, this committee and Congress ought to take seriously the recommendation made by the 9/11 Commission over 2 decades ago, arguing that our appropriation system when it comes to intelligence is broken. There are a variety of ways you might consider it. There's ideas about a joint committee, ideas about combining authorizations and appropriations. All those are hard, I know, in Congress. At the same time, there are things that ought to be taken seriously, and consideration ought to be given at a minimum to create an intelligence appropriations subcommittee within the House and Senate Appropriations Committee. With that, I thank the chairman and the ranking member and the members of the committee for their time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jaffer. I appreciate your input. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called for after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to get to this topic, and I think all of y'all have sort of touched on it, but how has the counterintelligence threat changed since 9/11? That's for any of the three that want to comment.
The short answer is the counterintelligence CI threat has become more pervasive and more systemic, given the rise of players around the world, and as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, the use of AI and the things that machine learning, the tools that are available to the counterintelligence players make it much more challenging for us on defense unless we can do more offensive actions, which is a different equation. So the short answer is it's more pervasive, more systemic, and more challenging for all of us.
Thank you. Any further comment on that?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said in my oral testimony, 25 years ago, the terrorist threats the United States faced were primarily foreign. Now they've also bled into domestic, and they've blended together. So that's one dimension that I think has changed, is that we're asking the intelligence community and law enforcement to cover a much wider remit than they had 25 years ago. Secondly, I think is a problem of, that Professor Jaffer referred to, the franchises of the main terrorist organizations. 25 years ago, the main threat was from al-Qaeda. Now we face threats from al-Qaeda, ISIS, but more importantly, their franchises. And Professor Jaffer had mentioned ISIS-K. ISIS-K, in a very short period of time, went from being able to operate in Afghanistan to operate in Turkey, in Iran, in Russia, and in the United States, of course, on New Year's Day 2025. So that's another problem. And then it's just the information overload that we see from activities where local terrorist groups aspire to become regional and even international threats and enlist lone wolves or lone actors to act on their behalf.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, just very quickly, we've seen the mayor of Arcadia arrested for being, Arcadia, California, for being a Chinese spy. We've seen a Harvard professor not only indicted by the Department of Justice for working with China, but having gone to China, actually established an operation there now, operating out of China. The Chinese government is aggressively operating in this country in ways that are hard to determine, hard to assess. The IC has got to get on top of that. We have to give them more resources and more capabilities. And the Russians remain extremely active. CI is probably, if not the #1 threat today, #2 to our country.
So you think our current CI efforts are too reactive, focused on individual cases rather than strategic campaigns by foreign governments?
I think that's exactly right. We need a larger operational strategic plan against these threats, particularly China. You know, we had an operation that we were working really effectively in the first Trump administration at the Justice Department. Unfortunately, that got wound down in the Biden administration. It hasn't really been effectively reestablished in the current Trump administration. I think in part because we're trying to do deals with China. That's a mistake. We need to get on top of that, Mr. Chairman.
Let me ask you this. So in the post-9/11 environment, as all of you have indicated, the threat landscape has evolved significantly. How do we improve coordination? And I'm thinking about how we integrate other agencies, other departments within into the IC. For example, departments of agriculture, commerce, transportation, et cetera. How we adopt more of a whole of government approach as it applies to our counterterrorism, our counterintelligence threats. And I'd welcome comments from all three of you on that.
Well, it's a great question and challenge, Mr. Chairman, in terms of incorporating those departments and agencies that aren't dealing in the IC world, don't have clearances. How do you protect sources and methods to make sure they have the information that is, again, timely and actionable? For example, you mentioned the Department of Agriculture. If there is a threat by a foreign actor to do something against our agricultural infrastructure, how is that best actioned? And so that's one of the challenges in terms of information sharing and then actioning that. So it's a deep question with lots of responses.
So, you know, for me, it's not about, you know, splitting hairs about Title 50 authority. It's about subject matter expertise. And that subject matter expertise resides in those agencies, but they don't have the connective tissue to the IC. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And that's exactly what we experienced at the FBI prior to 9/11 and then afterwards trying to deal with that.
Any Dr. Hoffman?
I would agree with everything that Mr. Pistole said, but the one thing that I would add that I think is absolutely critical is improving integration and coordination with state, local, and tribal authorities, because terrorism has become local. On New Year's Eve in 2025, we had an individual radicalized in Texas who then travels to New Orleans. And I think this underscores how we have to be entirely confident that the whole process, not just that there's integration at the federal level, but at the state, local, and tribal as well.
If I might, Mr. Chairman,
Sure.
The one thing I think that we could do that probably be most effective is to give security clearances to folks in those agencies and allow them to understand the full nature and scope of the threats. And to give security clearances, a lot more security clearances to our state and local partners, to our partners in the private sector. We've been talking for years about the threats to American industry, about the threats to state and locals, about the threats to our agricultural system, whether it's Chinese farmland threats or biosecurity threats. Yet a handful of people have TSSCI clearances in those departments, in industry. We need to get out to scale, give them the information, and gather from them the information, use them as our assets in the field to understand and really address these threats. We've never been really good at that when it comes to the IC. We've talked a lot about it. We've never really actioned that idea.
Excellent. Thank you. Ranking Member Himes.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got a bunch of questions, so I'm going to ask for fairly quick answers. Dr. Hoffman, this one starts with you. You know, I look at the defense that we played in the last 25 years, and it's worked pretty well. That's indicated in the number of terrorist attacks that have been stopped, our ability to reach out and touch terrorist groups around the world. What really troubles me is that if you compare the threat, it is much more numerous in many, many more places. The Sahel, across to Indonesia, here, domestic violence, it's domestically extremes here. So my question, Dr. Hoffman, if we really wanted to be serious about reducing the supply of terrorism out there, that is to say, compromising the ideology which seems to be attractive to people, doing more to stop the supply, what would we do?
Well, you know, the architecture we had to wage the war of ideas, which is, after all, President Bush defined the war on terror would be in part a war of ideas, was always, in my view, incomplete. And that's because there's no clear metrics. When you kill or capture a terrorist, you can tick off a box. It's very hard to ever discern if we've changed demands or women's attitudes, if we've re-engineered their drift towards extremism. So it's always been hard to achieve, but I would say in the diminution of what's perceived to be the terrorist threat, because we haven't had a major attack, that a lot of the focus on, let's say, the soft power dimensions of counterterrorism have also eroded, and our information capability, our public diplomacy capabilities have also been scaled back, I think, in a way that is not helpful to addressing precisely your question.
So give us some specific examples. Soft power is a very abstract term. What is a specific thing that we could do that would reduce the attraction of, let's just say, radical political Islam for young men in Yemen, Somalia, Indonesia, et cetera?
Well, we've never really tried, but, and as I said, it's very difficult to mention, but certainly activities of what was the United States Information Agency, it was so powerful during the Cold War, for example, activities of U.S. Agency for International Development that provide a view of the United States strengthening the world, strengthening communities throughout the world in a non-kinetic fashion, Radio Free Liberty, Radio Europe, various newspapers and radio and television that also actively counter and combat the narrative that is entrenched and continues to be peddled by terrorist organizations.
So I hear you say that here, approaching the 25th anniversary of 9/11, that the dismantlement of USAID and the dismantlement of Radio Free, all of our information, was perhaps not helpful to stemming the growth of terrorism.
In my opinion, yes.
Thank you. Second question, this is for anybody. One of the most controversial topics on this committee and in this institution is the ODNI. So very quickly, because I don't have a ton of time, I'd just love to hear from all three of you. What is the ODNI doing really well and that we need to preserve, and what could it be doing a lot better and we should focus on? Mr. Jaffer, let me start with you.
Well, I think what the ODNI has done well is it's really brought the community together. What it really needs to do better is really consolidate programs, budget authorities, and the like, and really do its knitting. ODNI has gotten way bigger than I think we ever expected it to be. I think narrowing it down, focusing it on a couple of things, budget, authorities, integration, those should be its core rather than all the other things it's got its hands in.
Do you have a specific example of something that it's doing that we should stop it from doing? You said all the other things it has its hands in.
I think in large part, ODNI has outgrown its size. It's become very large relative to what I think its mission ought to be. If you would come back to me in a minute about what programs we might neck down, I'll come up with a couple ideas. But in writ large, it's a very large bureaucratic institution. It doesn't need to be that. It ought to be a tiger team, smaller, tighter, more focused on integration.
Okay, I appreciate that. What you're suggesting without identifying units or functions, it's just, we should just cut every unit there by 10%. So do think about it.
I will.
Dr. Hoffman?
I would agree with Professor Jaffer that the ODNI has gotten much larger than it was ever intended to be. I mean, it's hard for me. I haven't had security clearances now in 6 years. It's hard for me to discern what the value added nowadays is by the ODNI. It seems that the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, in my view, is the driving force behind counterterrorism policy and operations.
I would just add that I think it was a great idea to institutionalize the different aspects of the IC, especially as it relates to the collection and analysis and then collection requirements for each of the different agencies. For the last 6 or 7 years, I've been on the Board of Visitors for the National Intelligence University, which is now being merged into the National Defense University. There are some pros and cons of that, but I think I agree with my colleagues that it is probably outgrown its usefulness in terms of the size and should be streamlined to focus on those key aspects that will help identify and prevent terrorist attacks from happening in the homeland.
Thank you. I'm out of time, but I would like to follow up on this issue. I think there is an emerging consensus that is not a lot more specific than what we heard today, but that is an institution that is both critical and in need of reform and right-sizing. And I think that's something we're going to want to follow up on. Thank you. Yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and I recognize the distinguished chairwoman, Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Chairman Crawford. Mr. Pistol, in your opening statement, you talked about one of the thematic findings of the initial 9/11 Commission was this failure of imagination. When I take a step back and think about this technological sea change that we have undergone over the past 25 years, whether it's AI, quantum, cyber, drones, or this, that needs to be addressed. How can we address these emerging technologies when it comes to our counterterrorism posture?
Thank you for the question, and I think you've hit it right on the head, Madam Chair. Congresswoman, and it really gets to that unity of effort issue that that the 9/11 addressed. But the 9/11 Commission was focused on unity of effort within the U.S. government. I think it's much more broad than that. It's a public-private partnership in a way that our high-tech companies, especially those who are investing billions in AI and all these different things, how can we best leverage what they are doing that we are not doing in the U.S. government to make sure that there are no gaps, that there's not a failure of imagination to say, okay, have you considered this, and what about this opportunity that could be exploited, on just zero-day exploits and things that have happened that we could anticipate, like we did not do on 9/11.
Mr. Jaffer, you referenced AI as an opportunity for the IC to utilize technological tools to strengthen our posture when it comes to counterterrorism. One of the concerns that has been raised both publicly in reporting is terrorist organizations using AI or lone wolf using AI. Can you talk to me about that? And I also want your perspective on the question I asked Mr. Pistol.
Yeah, Chairwoman, I think you're exactly right that there is a potential threat that non-state actors, adversaries who don't have capability today will advance their capabilities using AI. There's no doubt that AI has the ability to up-level all, including threat actors to the United States. That's actually all the more reason why we need to use it more effectively and as effectively as possible. The reality is that technological advance is going to benefit the offense as much as it's going to benefit the defense. If we don't take advantage of it now, we'll fail. We have more capabilities. We have every leading AI company essentially in the world is here in the United States. Every leading technology company is here in the United States. We have the ability to take that technology advantage and put it to use for us. The problem is we allow disagreements over politics, disagreements over which technology is better than the other to prevent us from using that technology, and fear about how to use that technology and whether it will work in our classified systems and whether we can use it with compartmented information or not. We need to get past that and move down the road. And I do think there's an opportunity here for us to take advantage of that, in particular, taking large amounts of information and necking it down and being able to identify threats in real time. On your question about, remind me of the question that you asked, Mr. Bristol, I apologize.
Just the technological sea change when you think of drones. It's not just AI. Drones, cyber, quantum, none of those were mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report, and there's been a technological shift over the past 25 years. How do we address this in the IC community?
Look, I think we have to work differently. I think the IC has always been at the leading edge of technology, and now it's fallen behind, not because of any particular reasons, because the technology advance is now happening in the private sector. To Mr. Bristol's point, we have to bond tightly with the private sector. We don't give them the level of access to information that we have because we hold government information too close, yet we use contractors all the time to obtain and collect that information. If we were to let the technology community in the door and we were to partner tightly with them, and by the way, expect more of them. All too often we see technology companies say we're global companies when it comes time to work with the U.S. government, when it comes time for them to take advantage of the U.S. government and benefit from our technology or our national security capabilities or threats they're facing. Oh, now they're an American company. We have to hold all of our technologies to the test, and technology companies to the test and say, look, if you want to be an American company, you got to work with the U.S. government. It's not acceptable to say no. It's not acceptable to put artificial barriers in the way of the U.S. government. At the same time, if we don't partner on quantum, on AI, on all these areas, tightly with the private sector, we will fail because the U.S. government today is not the leading edge of technology.
And then you said something in your opening statement. You said the threat is higher than it's ever been, even when compared to pre-9/11, the threats then. Can you further expound upon that?
Yeah. I think the reason why is it's less because there's a massive threat from terrorists, which there is, but it's because the threat today is also coming from China, from Russia, from Iran, and from North Korea. We've never been at a time when as many countries of the world have nuclear weapons pointed at the United States, able to deliver them. We've never been at a point in the world where so many countries of the world that are opposed to us are on the verge of nuclear capability. Iran with 440 kilograms of 60% highly enriched uranium. We've never been at a point where the terrorist threat remains high and is now being advanced even more than ever by nation-state actors. Nation-state actors are collaborating with these terrorist groups to help them come after the United States and Western interests. So the fact that we've remained relatively safe at home for the last 20, 25 years is not because the threat isn't real. It's because we've been on the offense against the threat. We're now taking our eye off the ball. We're letting authorities decay. We're getting soft at the time when the height is most high.
My time's expired. Yield back.
The gentleman yields. Ranking Member Gottheimer.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. This could be for all three of you actually, if you don't mind, because I think it's such a critical question. Do you feel that we are in a better place in terms of agencies coordinating with each other, communicating with each other, than we were before? That was obviously a major flag coming out of the commission report led to DNI and the formation of DNI in the first place. Do you think we're better at that now?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Sir, Mr. Sheffer. By the way, you can add more than absolutely if you want.
I think we are certainly better today than we were before 9/11. Are we good enough? Absolutely not. We need to get dramatically better. Part of the problem, I think, is that agencies tend to respond to the way Congress operates. And the reality is that as good as we are at 1050 and the issues between the defense community and the intelligence community, right, we've not done a good job on the Hill reuniting those capabilities and those authorities. And so as a result, the executive branch needs to reflect that. The fight over 702 and this question about a warrant requirement, the idea that we might reestablish something appearing like a wall is sending a message to the intelligence community. Collect less, be more careful, don't get aggressive against threats. And again, it's not to say that we shouldn't keep an eye, strong out for privacy and liberties, but we, the American people and our representative in Congress, are sending a message to the IC, to the executive branch: slow down, be more cautious, don't share as much information. That is the wrong message to be sending in this era of heightened threat.
Since you all were, involved in the earliest stages of 9/11 Commission report, or commented on it, or testified on it, or a couple of you did at least, is there anything that was left out that you say now we should have included that, or this was, something that we shouldn't have included that we did include?
The one thing that I would comment on, Congressman, is the recommendation that has not truly been fully implemented as recommended, and that's congressional oversight. Of course, when DHS was created as a result of the legislation, the one thing that they recommended was streamlining congressional oversight, which the reason for it is to make sure that Congress, both houses, Senate and House, understand what the issues are. And so are the threats are real, the stakes are high, how do we best address that from a legislative standpoint? And the fact that there were over 100 committees and subcommittees when DHS was created that had oversight for DHS, that's just problematic. You could have the secretary, the deputy secretary, undersecretaries up here testifying all the time and not doing the job that they've been hired to do. So that's the one recommendation that is left unfinished, I believe, overall.
Right, confusing to people who has oversight and too many having oversight. They should all just be centralized here, in my opinion. Yeah. So
yes.
The AI, building on what Ms. Stefanik said actually before, I believe that AI could be a huge national security asset if done the right way, but alarmed that we're not being honest about what it does for our enemies, Iran, China, and Russia, using it for disinformation and cyber attacks. The 9/11 Commission warned, as Elise said a few minutes ago, about a failure of imagination. We couldn't conceive of the attack coming. AI lets a small cell plan a complex attack faster with less footprint and less warning for us. Do you think we are ahead or behind our adversaries? And is this one of those things where do you think we're not using our imagination right now?
Look, I think the way we're not using our imagination is realizing that they are going to use this capability, and that if we don't use it to defend, we won't succeed. We will fail miserably if we don't use this capability and use it at scale. And so it's less a problem of having the capability. We have it. The leading companies are here. The problem is we're being limited in our implementation. We are self-limiting ourselves when it comes to defense. The offensive actors are not going to limit themselves. China is not going to use Mythos and ChatGPT 5.5 Cyber to come after the United States. If we don't use it for defense at scale and partner tightly with industry to give them the capability to defend themselves and help them defend themselves, we will fail because the offense will go first.
To that point, Mr. Jaffer, you mentioned talking about the homeland, and a couple of you talked about like the fact that the lines have been blurred. You've been talking about the lines being blurred. Do you think, how serious is the risk of an Iran-directed mass casualty attack on U.S. soil right now? Because do you think we're not prepared for it? Do you think we are thinking this through enough, and the agencies have the wherewithal to think between domestic and foreign?
I think one of the main problems is that we've been so successful in keeping the homeland safe over the past quarter of a century, there is once again a return to what the 9/11 Commission called as this lack of imagination. I mean, look at the news in the past couple of weeks. You have Iran paying criminals to carry out terrorist attacks in the United States and elsewhere. That's kind of an out-of-the-box or outside of the traditional lines of counterterrorism. You know, my view about science and technology, everything that's been said is true. But think about it. We were great before 9/11 in developing a drone capability. The CIA did, to attack terrorists, reapers and predators. Our defenses against drone attacks, in my view, are non-existent, or at least lamentably behind what has emerged only because of the Ukraine war and now the war with Iran as a salient threat. What's to stop any terrorist group anywhere from importing commercial drones and carrying out an attack on a major urban center? And how well is any city in the United States, much less the coordination between federal, state, and local, to deal or to handle or to counter such an attack? I'd say it's not very encouraging.
Thank you. I yield.
Gentleman yields. Vice Chairman General Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we approach the 25th anniversary of September 11th, this hearing is an important opportunity to examine what reforms work, where gaps remain, and whether our intelligence architecture is adapting fast enough to modern threats. The 9/11 Commission identified failures in information sharing, integration, and imagination. In response, Congress and the executive branch implemented major reforms, including the creation of the DNI and the National Counterterrorism Center, which significantly improved coordination across the intelligence community. At the same time, the threat environment has evolved considerably since 2001. Terrorism remains a persistent threat, but we are also confronting cyber attacks, foreign malign influence, gray zone aggression, AI-enabled threats, and increasing blurred lines between foreign and domestic threats. My focus today is whether the post-9/11 intelligence frameworks remains agile enough to address the next generation of threats while preserving effective oversight, accountability, and civil liberties. And I want to get right to the point. We would have had another 9/11 had it not been for 702. We would have. Anybody who is too ignorant to acknowledge that, and the games that we play with this, and I think it was you, Dr. Jaffer, who said that our letting it go dark or letting it go away is a non-starter, a non-entity. The political games need to stop. When abuses are found, people should go to jail. People should be, they should have harsh treatment when they violate the civil liberties of the Americans. But I used to prosecute as a district attorney. Murder is against the law, but people still break the laws. We have laws in place and reforms in place. How important is 702, each of you, to making sure that we continue to keep America safe?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. It is literally the most important intelligence collection authority, bar none, that we have. 60% of the President's daily brief comes from 702 collected information. It has stopped terrorist threats. It allows us to get Ayman al-Zawahiri. It allowed us to, just in the last 2 years alone, it has stopped a variety of cyber, intelligence, and terrorist threats to the United States, not just here, but to our friends and allies abroad and to Americans abroad. And so it could not be more important. And I'll say this, not only should Congress make it permanent, because here's the thing, we don't need a renewal statute, right, or a sunset statute for Congress to do oversight or to change the law if the law is problematic or if there are problems with private civil liberties. We don't need to walk up to the line every 2 to 3 to 4 years and put ourselves in this position. It's simply political brinksmanships, and it should stop.
I think, Dr. Hoffman, you talked about the ODNI and how it's had some good things at work, but it's getting too large. It is maybe not operating in the intended way. What reforms or what changes would you make to make the Office of the Director of National Intelligence more effective and to be able to coordinate and collate better?
Well, first, let me just say with 702, I agree completely with Professor Jaffer how essential and important. When I was a commissioner in the FBI Review Commission, this was something that even a decade ago was front and center of the FBI's concerns that it had to be continued. That's an easier question to answer than the ODNI. I mean, I spent 2 years working in the CIA's scholar in residence for counterterrorism. And interface with the NCTC, interface with other elements of the intelligence community was something that one was cognizant of on a daily basis. I mean, as it affected me as an analyst then, the OD&I really didn't have much of a role. I mean, it's supposed to integrate overall. I think it probably has done a good job in that, but lacking budgetary authority, control over personnel, the fact that so many of the intelligence agencies, and rightly report to the Secretary of Defense, means that that position is always going to be limited. So I'm not necessarily sure there is a way to reform it.
And I would just add, Congressman, and thank you for your prosecutorial work. I was on the senior advisory board for the OD&I in 2 different administrations. And one of the things that we tried to emphasize is the operational work that the centers would do, like NCTC. Terrific work, operationally focused, integrating state and locals, tribal, all those different things. And yet the bureaucracy around all that, trying to move agilely and proactively, that was of concern that we raised in 2 administrations, and I think that's something to pursue by this committee.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Jaffer, Dr. Hoffman. It's always good to see a fellow Hoosier. President Pistole, thank you for all that you do. President Pistole, this is for you, sir, and others can chime in. I want to start with fusion centers. Before coming to Congress, I was a supervisor at the Intelligence Fusion Center in Indiana, so I know firsthand how they work, and you've done work with them. But I worry about the role, essentially, of state and local law enforcement in counterterrorism and the fact that they're not getting enough attention. Are fusion centers, sir, in your mind, being used to their full potential, or are we still treating local and state law enforcement like a secondary part of a greater counterterrorism strategy?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, and good to see you, sir. I think the concern that I've had and many have had about fusion centers over the decades now is that they have been a place to park people that might not be operationally focused. And so the question is, what are the fusion centers doing versus the Joint Terrorism Task Forces? And who's got the operational lead? Well, of course, the JTTFs, if it's something that is, okay, there's a lead, there's a terror cell we need to disrupt or something. So the question becomes, what is actionable and timely and relevant for the fusion centers to act on? And I think redefining their roles and responsibilities would be helpful in clarifying that issue.
Yes, sir. Dr. Hoffman?
I can't comment on the fusion centers, but the one thing I've observed in recent years is that DHS funding for training and for coordination between federal, state, and local and tribal is precipitously declining. It's at a lower level than it's been in years, and that to me is the glue that holds together our defenses against terrorism in this country.
Yes, sir. Mr. Jaffer?
Well, Congressman Carson, as you know, having served in the Indiana Fusion Center, one of the challenges the Fusion Center faces is whether they should be all threats or whether they should be focused in on a handful of things like counterterrorism, like counterintelligence, and the like. To my view, and I actually, when I was a staff member on this committee, we did a study of the fusion centers and went around the country in a bipartisan way and looked at the various fusion centers. I think what we found back then, and my sense is the same as the challenge today, is that different fusion centers are doing different things, and most of them, a lot of them, are all threats, all hazards fusion centers, and that makes it very hard to focus in on the handful of things that are really important. If I were doing it over again, I'd recommend that the federal government put money into the fusion centers, but money focused on only a handful of things, and tell them, look, you're going to do these 3 things with our money, and that's what you should focus in on. I'd put counterterrorism on that list, probably counterintelligence, cyber, and the like, because there's so many threats across the country that FBI and the rest of our intelligence agencies can't really scale to.
All right. Thank you all. Yield back, Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you all for being here. I thought it was interesting on the committee's recommendation about combining appropriations and authorizations in HPSCI and SISI. Now, I know I would like to see that, but I'm curious why the commission would why you think that would be a good idea.
Well, Congressman, obviously it would make life a lot easier if the authorizers could decide where the money was going to be spent and then actually put those monies on target. It would solve the 2-step problem, having to convince more people about a given issue. This committee, in particular, being a select committee like the Senate side committee, has a specific role and mission. It was designed to focus in on intelligence programs, to provide protection for private civil liberty, but to lean forward on those missions. And if you're separated from the money that allows you to lean forward, it makes it impossible to actually action it. Think about all the overhead collection programs that we have that this committee has sought to prioritize, but can't get the Appropriations Committee to support. That's just one example. There's dozens of them. So if you combined it, that would make life easier for this committee. It would take the real experts in this room and allow you to actually put lead on target. The problem, of course, is that's not how we've ever operated. If we try to operate that way, it'll be very hard to do. It'll take away power from the Cardinals. It's an almost impossible political task. That's why I think maybe if we can't get there, then the next step might be create an intelligence subcommittee, and so you're out from the hack-D, sack-D situation, and the committee then is able to really effectively work. And what I'd do is I would cross members of this committee, including the chair and ranking member, to that Appropriations Committee, and you essentially solve the problem but work within the current constraints.
Appreciate that.
I would just add to that, Congressman, if I could, that having testified before both authorizers and appropriators, that was a cumbersome process for everybody involved, and I think by combining them into a streamlined process, maybe not some type of hybrid, would help everybody in terms of addressing national security issues, which again, there needs to be a sense of urgency on all sides, and having this, I'll call it a bifurcated process, I think gets away from that sense of urgency that, okay, I've got my domain, you've got your domain, shall they come together? Well, we'll see. So I would, yes.
On the issue of connective tissue, and that was supposed to be solved by the ODNI, it's still an issue because different agencies use different reporting formats. There's different training, whether you're training to recruit a source or recruit a confidential informant. These are vastly different training. And how do you think we've progressed since then? And having a common database, having a common place where all of different agencies, whether it's state, local, the different federal agencies can actually access information that is relevant to them.
So I would just jump in by saying, having been a graduate of the FBI Academy at Quantico, that was distinct training for a domestic law enforcement officer and analyst. I did several graduations, presented creds at the farm for CIA, and that's obviously a whole different set of responsibilities and everything else. So I think it's that the uniqueness of each agency, and then the question becomes perhaps where you're going is the ODNI, are they doing something in a way to coordinate better the efforts of the disparate responsibilities of the agencies within the IC?
Okay, I'll leave it there. Going back to 702 and the importance of that, one of the examples I often use is, what if you had a warrant requirement and you were tasking a certain known terrorist abroad, and he was talking about flight training in Florida, and you wouldn't, if you had a warrant requirement, you would not be able to query or search for the name of the flight training location in Florida, would you?
I mean, it's crazy, right? The idea...
And then you wouldn't be able to say, wait, there's a bunch of other known terrorists also looking for flight training at that same place.
If only that weren't an actual scenario that took place before 9/11. I mean, this is exactly what the 9/11 Commission pointed out, which is that the idea of having lawfully collected information in a federal government database, but you can't look at it until you go to a judge and ask for Mother May I. By the way, without the information you need, you can't even use that information to get the probable cause court order you might need. So at the very time when the intelligence community realizes we have a threat, we have a terrorist talking to an American or somebody in the United States, we now got to go ask a federal judge for information. It is exactly the point at which we need to be able to look at the database. We'd be prohibited from doing it. The American people will hold all of us accountable if there's information in a 702 database and we can't look at it because we voluntarily put a warrant requirement in place that the Constitution and law today does not require.
Real quick, in last 5 seconds, do you, when there is a warrant for someone's communications and yet companies say that they're encrypted apps, they can't access that, should that be something that the government needs to deal with?
Absolutely. The idea that we would put information off limits to the government is hugely problematic. There are ways to solve this problem, protect privacy civil liberties, use strong encryption. The idea that the U.S. government would have the capability to access encrypted data does not destroy privacy. It does not destroy encryption. There are ways that we've developed that will allow us to do that. The problem is the privacy civil liberties community is so dug in on this issue, they won't accept anything but absolute limitations.
I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of you for your service and for coming in today. Mr. Pistole, following the 9/11 attacks, you were responsible for directing the National Joint Terrorism Task Force, or JTTF, right?
Yes, I helped create what's known as the National JTTF, and I had oversight for all the regional JTTFs.
And they did good work. I know this because in 2022, the JTTF in my hometown of Chicago led efforts to prevent a plot to attack Naval Station Great Lakes near Chicago. So you would agree with me that JTTFs are critical to our counterterrorism efforts, especially in a post-9/11 world, right?
Yes, again, absolutely.
It was a surprise to me that the FBI diverted counterterrorism efforts like the JTTFs to support the president's immigration agenda. According to data acquired by Senator Warner of the Senate Intel Committee last October, nearly half, 45% of the FBI agents in major U.S. field offices were reassigned from counterterrorism, counterintelligence, and other work to aid ICE in its immigration efforts. And I think that's just plain wrong. I think it makes us less safe as a country. I'd like to turn to another topic, and that is the rise of anti-Semitism, but also the rise of Islamophobia. 20 years after 9/11 happened, Islamophobia in the U.S. has not gone away. Just this weekend, we saw the horrific killing of 3 people at a San Diego mosque. One of the things that really I thought George W. Bush did well in the wake of 9/11 was he actually made it clear that the war on terror is not a war against any single religion, and that we should all band together against terrorism wherever it rises. However, I'm concerned that Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, all of these isms are on the rise. And so I just want to go person by person. Mr. Pistole, you would agree with me, Islamophobia and hate has no place in America, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Hoffman?
Of course.
And Mr. Jaffer, Islamophobia and hate have no place in America.
Well, as a Muslim, I don't like Islamophobia. Yeah, that's right. But also, I mean, I want to be clear. We have seen a rise in both these trends, anti-Semitism and anti-Islamism here in the United States. And I will say this, a lot of the people who practice those views are the same people, right? You see the vile stuff that you hear on podcasts, that you hear platformed by certain think tanks in this town. The same people who hate Jewish people hate Muslims just as much. There is a lot of overlap between these groups here in the United States and in Europe, and we need to identify that and recognize that we're actually stronger together than at each other's throats. And the reality is that rise is happening here in the United States, it's happening here in this town, it is happening right across the street at certain think tanks in this town that are supporting people who are both anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim, and that has to stop.
Thank you for bringing that up. I just want to point out 2 things that I saw recently on social media that bother me to no end. Here is Senator Tommy Tuberville posted this. He said, less than 25 years apart, he puts the 9/11 attack on one side and then Mayor Mamdani on the other side. I find that to be just completely unacceptable. I want to show you another social media post as well that is very bothersome. This is from Congressman Randy Fine. He said, we need more Islamophobia, not less. Fear of Islam is rational. Mr. Jaffer, I'd like to hear your comments about that.
I mean, obviously, everyone in the United States has a right to free speech, but that is the kind of speech that people should condemn and criticize and attack. The idea that members of Congress think it's okay to say things like that, the idea that think tanks in this town think it's okay to platform neo-Nazis, the idea that we tolerate that kind of behavior, anti-Semitism, anti-Islamism in this country, is ridiculous. There's no doubt that a lot of terrorists that come after this country are motivated by radical forms of Islam. It's okay to say that. There's no doubt that people who attack Jewish people in Israel, Hamas, are motivated by anti-Semitism. It's okay to say that. What it's not okay to do is to stand in front of this country and say that Muslims as a group, or Jews as a group, are problematic, are not acceptable in this country, should not be here, should not be a part of our society. The very reason that people want to come to this country, the very reason that we are all here, and the very reason that we are all successful, is because we've brought a vast range of people together. We've made them all Americans. And we all move forward together as Americans, not as Jews, not as Muslims, not as people from Germany or from Iran or from Iraq, but as Americans.
Thank you for that eloquent statement. I would just say thank you to all of you for standing up against Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, Hindu-phobia, all phobias. They have no place in America. Hate has no place in America, and it's counter to all of our values. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Wagner.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like so many Americans, I still vividly remember where I was on September 11th. I remember the shock and the fear and the anger, but I also remember how this country came together, how complete strangers came to the aid of their fellow Americans, and how we all, as a nation, declared that we would never, ever let this happen again. Now, almost 25 years later, the world has changed, but our mission remains the same. Our adversaries are more advanced, their tactics have evolved, and their capabilities have matured. To ensure the safety of the American people, our intelligence community must adapt faster. This Congress, I was appointed the chairman of the Subcommittee on Open Source Intelligence. This is the first time that Congress has created a legislative body dedicated solely to an intelligence discipline, and it could not come at a better time. Open source intelligence, or OSINT, is being utilized more and more than ever, not just in the IC, but throughout the private sector too. For example, there are now commercial platforms that can map global shipping patterns in real time, detect anomalies across millions of data points within seconds. They can provide insights that would have taken weeks or months just a few years ago. With an ocean of raw data growing exponentially each day, the intelligence community's ability to analyze this abundance of information with speed and accuracy is vital to our national security. Because if we fall behind, our adversaries gain the strategic advantage on the battlefield and here at home. Key to this effort is communication and collaboration between federal agencies, between federal and state partners, and between the public and private sectors. Mr. Jaffer, given the proliferation of open source intelligence, should Congress consider reforming classification and declassification requirements to improve intelligence sharing with state, local, and private sector partners?
Absolutely, and I think the most important thing that Congress can do in this space is to give more security clearances for the highest end form of intelligence. As you know, Congresswoman, having served on this committee, HPSCI information is qualitatively different than information you get at the collateral TS or the secret level, and dramatically more valuable. And so if we want to make real partners in the state and local community, and by the way, in the private sector most importantly, because today they're at the leading edge of technology, they're also at the leading edge of the threat from China, Russia, Iran, and other actors. We need to empower them with what we know, and by the way, expect the same back from them, for them to share information with us that we can utilize as well. We don't do enough of that. We don't hold them accountable. We also don't hold ourselves accountable to give them the information they need and can act on, and not just in a skiff and make it only in unusable form.
Ms. Jaffer, do you believe the IC could use siloed artificial intelligence capabilities on our classified networks to rewrite products at a lower classification level, or even the unclassified level?
I love this, Congresswoman Wagner. Absolutely. In fact, you know what I think they can do is we can actually take highly compartmented information and using AI, take it down to a collateral TS, collateral S level, allow the insights to be shared without the sources and methods getting out. I think there's dramatic value there. That's why we need to sprint towards this capability now. The challenge, of course, is that we're being too cautious and stepping too carefully, if anything.
Agree. Dr. Hoffman, in what ways are non-state terrorist groups utilizing publicly available or commercially available information to carry out attacks or other actions?
Clearly, all kinds of technology, from things like the New Orleans vehicular attack using
Yes.
Google Glasses, to carry out surveillance, for example, and record surreptitiously. So he wasn't holding up his iPhone or holding up a camera. He just had eyeglasses that he could use. Certainly the power of that artificial intelligence, but just the availability of open source material to carry out intelligence and reconnaissance in a detailed fashion from one's desktop is enhanced appreciably. And then there's also the vulnerability of our personal information. I mean, anyone in the public eye now, for 99 cents, individuals can get all their personal details to their home address, social security numbers, cell phone numbers, and so on, which facilitates the attacks on persons or threats and harassment being directed against them.
And we have adversarial nations, foreign nations such as China, Iran, and Russia, who are working with terrorist groups to enhance their ability to act, as you've talked about, on publicly available or commercially available information. My time's expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlewoman yields. Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all. It's been touched on, but I want to give you, as we get toward the end here, all three a chance to do the deepest dive about what seemed to be so fundamental about the 9/11 report was the need for better coordination, sharing of information. I remember Director Coates talking about this, that he felt his real job was developing relationships and trust between the agencies and, as you say, public-private partnerships in the state and local governments. So feel free to include that, but also, as you've begun to touch on classification rules or originator control restrictions, compartmented programs, what else can we still do to make sure that all the agencies are getting what they need from each other?
Well, I would start off by just affirming the recommendation that I referenced in my opening statement from the 9/11 Commission, that unity of effort is critical, and that's not just in terms of policies and procedures and protocol, but also personnel. When you get people involved in their fiefdoms or their kingdoms, if you will, or queendoms, whatever it is, that they sometimes get territorial. And if you're protecting sources and methods, absolutely. To the Congresswoman's question, I think there was a subtle bias against open source in the days, weeks, months, years after 9/11, because that wasn't seen as significant as classified information, especially TSSCI, even code name and all these different things. And so I think that issue of unity of effort needs to be revisited. So I applaud the work of the committee to look at this, to say what can and should be done now, not next year, not next decade or so. What can be done now to address these issues, to make sure there is a unity of effort that makes a difference? And that's the bottom line. What outcomes would be included in this to make sure there is better unity of effort?
I mean, I agree completely, but unity of effort is only part of it. There has to be the expertise and the training. We have to be able to attract the smartest people and the right people into government and to retain them. And just as the 9/11 Commission reflected 25 years ago, you can't have an intelligence community, especially in a world of open source information, that just talks amongst itself, and that's become an echo chamber. There was a period, certainly for the decade after 9/11, where the intelligence community did open up to lots of different sources of information, whether it was people in my field who were professors or from think tanks and elsewhere. I've seen that over the past decade or so continue to close, where the intelligence community, in my view, is sliding back into the pre-9/11 mentality. It has great information. It privileges always classified information above all else. As the Congresswoman said, in an era of open source information, that's just as vital. And just as the 9/11 Commission said 25 years ago, it's having the broad perspective from outside of the community that's important.
And Congressman, just really quick to follow up, I do think while it's important to change classification rules and adjust them as needed, I do think that's a longer term, harder thing to do. I would say what we ought to do today is take advantage of the technology that we have, that innovators and investors are building today, to take our current classification rules and simply make that information more accessible to people who have lower clearances or don't have access to those compartments, right? Just because something is ORCON doesn't mean you can't take the insights from it, or compartmented, take the insights from it, put it at a level where it's abstracted enough that you're not revealing the source or method, and get it to somebody with a collateral TS or a secret clearance. I realize that's hard, but AI provides the capability to do it. You can have it vetted by humans. Humans can look at the output and say, yep, I think that's right, that's the right level of classification, and get it out the door. There are huge opportunities here. We don't have to change the rules. We can simply use technology smarter, and there are investors and innovators who support our national security who are willing to put effort into that.
For any of you, the question I always had was, how does one person in one agency know what somebody else is working on halfway across the world that they might need? Is there some systems or thoughts that you have in terms of how to solve that issue?
It's a great question, Congressman. There's been a lot of discussion about that, and depending on how sensitive the information is, if it's HPSCI compartmented, then probably not. And so that becomes problematic. For example, when I was the head of TSA, I started off every morning, just as I did at the FBI, receiving a HPSCI threat briefing about transportation issues, not about all the other things, not CI and all those other things. The question became, does the frontline workforce need to have that information? No, not that. They need to know is there a non-metallic IED that is being considered to be smuggled in? Is there a cargo plot? Something like that. But they don't need to know the sources or the methods of collection of that information. So I think that's part of the solution. How do you best get the operational information to the people who need it on the front lines?
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Tenney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, the Ranking Member Himes, Chairwoman Stefanik, and Chairman Gottheimer for holding this important hearing. America was changed forever, as we all know, by the attacks of September 11th. We continue to mourn the 2,977 individuals killed on that day, including a childhood friend of mine who was killed in the crash in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. We also remember and recognize the 125,000 first responders, survivors, and civilians who continue to suffer from severe health impacts from that. And I want to point out, just like Ms. Stefanik, as a New Yorker, I greatly appreciate the unique role, and you have all talked about, that Congress can play in evaluating the current status of the recommendations made in the 9/11 Commission report, ensuring that we do everything we can to prevent another tragedy like this from happening. And some of you have touched on this, and some of my colleagues have, but I want to focus on a recommendation included at the top of page 390 of the 9/11 Commission report, and I'll read it. It states, "The U.S. government cannot meet its own obligations to the American people to prevent the entry of terrorists without a major effort to collaborate with other governments." In particular, one of the notes under this recommendation states, "There is a growing role for state and local law enforcement agencies. They need more training and work with federal agencies so they can cooperate more effectively with those federal agencies in identifying terrorist suspects. Cooperation across all levels of law enforcement is critical to keeping New Yorkers and all Americans safe." The principle is exactly what underpins one of the most important cooperation tools we have. Everyone knows it, the 287G program, which allows ICE to train and deputize state and local law enforcement to identify, to detain, and to process illegal aliens who pose a threat to our national security. Through the program, although the program was actually predated 9/11, interestingly, in 1996, the first agreement was signed in law after 9/11 by the state of Florida, of all places, in direct response to those vulnerable. Now, here we are, 25 years later, the worst terrorist attack, and the most people were killed in New York City. Governor Hochul and many Democrats in New York want to ban the 287G agreements, including our own Attorney General, our top law enforcement official in the state of New York, wants to ban 287G agreements. She wants to promote sanctuary cities, and she has launched into a program to actually condemn and investigate and try to intimidate our local sheriffs who have engaged in this 287G program. And I say this because I represent a part of New York State, as does Ms. Stefanik, which borders Canada. We are a border security area. We started the Northern Border Security Conference in response to all the different terror attacks that have been happening and a lot of the known terrorists that have come across the border. The Intelligence Committee that I serve on, this committee has been fantastic, our staff, in helping identify some of that work, as have our intelligence agencies. So I want to ask each one of you, and just really quickly if you could answer, don't you think it is essential that we continue the work of our local law enforcement agencies, more eyes on the ground, to be able to continue this 287G program? And just quickly, I mean, don't you think this is folly for New York State to actually try to eliminate this program, as it's been helpful in keeping us safe. And you, Mr. Hoffman, said we haven't had a real major attack of the scale of 9/11 since then, and since the 287G program has been implemented. I wonder if you could just go down the dais here and give me your, just maybe a 5-10 second opinion on it.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm afraid that's outside the scope of my expertise, and so I'll defer on that to my colleagues.
So do you think that the 287G program, working with local and law officials, is effective?
Again, without regard to 287G, I think it's critically important that the federal agents, officers work with state and locals across the board. I'll defer to that.
Thank you. How about Mr. Hoffman?
Well, given that we have the World Cup games here, and we'll have the Olympics shortly, the importance of ensuring that there is the closest possible integration between federal, state, and local is even more critical now than it's ever been. I'd return to a previous point. I see that funding that facilitates that, joint training exercises, joint education, is being pared back precipitously in recent years.
Thank you. Mr. Javner.
Yeah, it strikes me that the federal government collaborating tightly with state and local law enforcement is critical, particularly on counterterrorism threats, and authorities like the ones you've cited are an important part of that process. At the same time, it's important that we focus on the threats to our nation.
Well, let me, before you get into that, let me just tell you something. This 287G program has saved lives, but I'll tell you right now, there are 7 states who are anti-police states, anti-ICE states, just like our new mayor, Mondami, has said, I want to defund ICE. I want to defund law enforcement. We want to defund the police. This is more of that. 7 states, Washington, Oregon, California, Illinois, New Jersey, Delaware, and Connecticut, have banned the ability of our local law enforcement to work together, as stated by the 9/11 Commission. Why are we going backwards? I think this is a threat to national security and really undermines our local police. So I just think that this is one of those things that is a good recommendation from the 9/11 Commission that we need to continue. But my time has expired, but I really appreciate you all being here. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Fallon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to echo the point of my colleague from New York, creating synergy with local and federal, it makes us all safer. Thank goodness that in these last 25 years, there hasn't been another attack on the homeland to this scale. And that was a worry I think we all had back in 2001. What I wanted to touch on a little bit is counterintelligence, because I think that we must be creative and innovative. And what would you do? How would you hit us if you were our enemy? And I'm not talking just from a traditional nation-state standpoint, but asymmetrical, non-state actors, terrorist groups, lone wolf, and new threats, as Representative Stefanik mentioned, about what tech advances really allow these bad actors to have at their fingertips. So if you are our enemies, how would you hit us? And so I wanted, if you could, real briefly, just touch on that and the importance of it.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I think that what you're getting at is if a foreign actor is able to get inside information, so you have an insider threat because somebody within fill-in-the-blank agency is providing information to them that is traitorous, that they should be charged with. I worked with 2 FBI agents who ended up providing information to the Soviets and then later the Russians. One person I sat right next to for the 16 weeks of Quantico. And he had a personal reason that he wanted to do that. And then, of course, Robert Hansen, one of the worst known spies, worked down the hall from me when I was at FBI headquarters. So there's that personal side of things. What's their personal motivation? Given all the advances in technology, I think you're right on point in terms of what can we be doing now to make sure that we have, again, a unity of effort, going back to the 9/11 Commission, to make sure we're dealing with the human aspects and then also making sure that we are looking for any tripwires that might be crossed by somebody who is sharing information with our adversaries.
And Congressman, I think you're exactly right. We need to go on the offense on counterintelligence threats. I would say there's one thing that we haven't done that we could really do helpfully, which is we allowed in 2020 authorities to expire, Section 215, the Lone Wolf Authority, you refer to lone wolves, as well as the Roving Wiretap Authority. That authority has now been expired for coming on 6 years. And that's a huge mistake, because when we're countering these threats, we need those capabilities to go after people. The same way we go after drug dealers and organized crime, the fact that we don't have that authority on counterterrorist threats and the like is a real problem.
I would say, how would they hit us? You just have to look at what Iran is doing throughout the world today. The plots in London where they're basically crowdsourcing terrorism, incidents in the United States where they've attempted to enlist criminals, biker gangs, drug dealers. I mean, these are all asymmetric threats. And then I would also reiterate something I said earlier, drone attacks in urban areas. I think we're woefully unprepared to counter.
What scares me is, a big event like the Super Bowl, something of that nature that's going to have all that attention, and now with the drone technology and rapidly advancing, that's what keeps me up at night. And one of the other things with, if I were our adversary, I'd pay journalists to write, to be my propagandists. I would invest in promising young politicians. I would have third parties donate to campaigns that would foster, my interests. Obviously, look the other way or facilitate cyber attacks. And then I'm really scared about sleeper agents near and trained in hitting us with infrastructure. These aren't Tom Clancy novels. This is real. And if I had the resources that Beijing or other nation states have, I sat on the task force, the assassination task force, and had that not been a lone wolf attack in Butler, had it been a trained nation state actor, considering that there were 200 or 300 people closer to the president than the bad guy shooter, he would have been killed. It would have been awful. What I do want to touch on in my last minute is, with the 18 intel agencies we have, what specific reforms have you seen over the last several decades that have worked, that would be the things that you'd want to champion?
So returning to the 9/11 Commission recommendations and what I mentioned earlier, the unity of effort as it relates to the issue of the DNI setting requirements for all the IC agencies to collect against collectively to make sure that everybody's not doing disparate things of information that is not being shared or analyzed. And that was one of the major sea changes for the FBI, to see that going from probably the premier law enforcement agency in the world perhaps, to that of a collection, analysis, and information sharing agency that, as an FBI agent, my job was to collect evidence to prosecute somebody. It wasn't to share with others who didn't have a need-to-know basis. So I think that's one of the keys.
Well, my time has expired. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. Obviously, the challenge, as we get further and further past 9/11 is keeping our guard up. That's always been the challenge. When we drop our guard is generally when we're vulnerable to attack, and oftentimes when we are. Two things that come to mind. Number one, several 9/11 Commission recommendations. One that has been passed but not yet implemented, and that is the Victor Saraceni Aviation Safety Act, HR 911, which required secondary cockpit barriers. This was a chief finding of the 9/11 Commission to protect the cockpits during exchanges. It was named after a constituent of mine, Victor Saraceni, in Lower Makefield. And the other was originally an executive order passed by President George W. Bush regarding FISA 702, which was later codified. Both were strong recommendations of the 9/11 Commission. One has not been implemented at all. The second is under constant scrutiny and debate on a topic that was not under debate right after 9/11. There was no calls for a secondary warrant requirement on the querying of already lawfully collected data. Everybody knew how real and imminent the threat was, and we were going to do whatever it takes to stop it. So if I could just get you all to comment on those two items.
Thank you, Congressman. As it relates to the aviation security, of course, the reinforced cockpit doors on all commercial airliners, that was done, but not to the extent as it could have been done. And I think that was as a result of industry costs and things, what was actually necessary. And so one of the other aspects was to greatly expand the federal air marshals to be on critical flights, going from about 3 dozen FAMs on 9/11 to a classified number now, so the terrorists are not sure, is that person sitting there a federal air marshal who's armed, and then the federal flight deck officer training program, where airline pilots are trained at the federal air marshal's training facility to actually do close combat shooting, and that's something. Even if somebody is able to get into a cockpit on a change, on a longer flight, where the pilot comes out to go to the lab, Then they have the question of, is there a federal air marshal on board, and is a pilot or co-pilot in there armed and trained? And the federal air marshals are the most accurate marks people in the federal government because it's all close quarter.
I don't have the expertise to answer your question, but let me just emphasize, though, that the terrorist threat and their interest in targeting commercial aviation is ongoing. Of that, there's no doubt. Recent years, two operatives of al-Shabaab, which I would consider al-Qaeda's least technologically proficient franchise, has sent pilots to undertake the exact same training that the 9/11 pilots and hijackers undertook. Plans from al-Shabaab as well to secret bombs concealed in computers, very thin, undetectable explosives, have also been recorded in recent years. So this threat remains, even though it may not have the prominence of other terrorist ones.
Mr. Jeffrey?
Yeah, and thank you, Congressman Fitzpatrick. Look, the idea that we don't secure all the doors effectively, cargo doors and the like, is a huge problem. These planes can be used as a threat just as passenger jets can be. And so I think that legislation and ensuring that we do that is important to move forward and push forward as you have on that front. When it comes to 702, we talked about it earlier, the political theater of having to reauthorize this legislation that is critical to our national security, that provides 60% of the president's daily beef, that has stopped terrorist attacks in this country, abroad, has allowed us to arrest spies, to identify foreign threats to our nation for the better part of 2 decades, is just crazy. The idea that we keep coming back to it over and over again and keep running right up to the line and then do a week extension, a month extension, 45 days, in order so that Congress can consider changing the rules so that we can make it tougher to collect intelligence. One, making it tougher to collect intelligence is a terrible idea. Imposing a warrant requirement makes no sense and simply rebuilds the very 9/11 wall. To Congressman Fallon's point, if there was one thing I think the 9/11 Commission got right that we should double down on, it's keeping that wall down instead of rebuilding it. And the idea that we keep walking back up to that line is crazy. And the last thing I'll say about that is this. There is no question that Congress can and should do oversight over this law, just like it does over all the other laws. You don't need sunsets to do oversight. You don't need sunsets to make changes to laws if there's privacy and civil liberties problems. You only need sunsets if you want to engage in political theater every 2 to 4 years and put Congress to the test. That's silly. It's bad for our national security. We should stop doing it.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. There being no further members for recognition, we will adjourn. I appreciate the witnesses today. Thank you for your testimony, and we are adjourned.